Okay, there was an interesting subject, I guess you could say, a conversation that was brought up in a group online uh, earlier this week, I believe it was, and it brought to mind something I hadn't thought about in a very long time. By the way, for some weird reason, I'm currently banned from being able to comment in any groups, and I'm currently banned from starting any groups due to some kind of weird thing that's going on with the social media world. Who knows? Until December, it seems like I'm temporarily restricted until December. It's anybody's guess what the cause of that is. But anyway, there was a particular topic I was looking at that brought about a certain group I hadn't thought about in a very long time. I'm going to say I dropped into it around 2012, 2013. It was near the time when I was really getting burned out on the cult of Quackaholics Anonymous. But to be perfectly honest, I was burned out on that cult for a very long time. I'm not even going to say it was brainwashing. It was almost like an addiction. Even though I hated the meetings and even though I knew the meetings were bullshit, it was almost like at a certain time of day, I just would go to these meetings. And I think I've touched upon that before. But I don't know if it was due to the just extreme severe burnout of AA that caused me to try it, or if it was due to, I don't remember. There's no point in rehashing all of it, but there was this organization that had kind of started here and there. They weren't as large as AA, but it was called Celebrate Recovery, and out of just sheer boredom, I decided to check it out. Didn't know what I was getting into when I went there. Didn't know what was going to happen. I just knew it was something that wasn't AA at the time. I can say this one point in their favor, and I didn't agree with anything they were promoting, and I didn't agree with I don't agree with anything that says that your drinking, your drug problems are either a sin or a moral issue anyway. And I think anybody who doesn't believe their addictions are stemmed by a sin or by a moral failing probably wouldn't get anything out of CR any more than they would AA. One point in their favor, they're very open and upfront about the fact that they are a religious organization. They don't do the higher power thing that AA does, which, AA claims it's spiritual, not religious, and then goes on to preach a dogmatic religious type stance. I mean, your big book itself is just loaded with more or less hardcore old style Protestant religion is what I would say, Calvinist style religion even, enough that some Supreme Courts have ruled it's a religious organization. I used to have a link to all those cases. But anyway, when it comes to Celebrate Recovery, there's a couple of things I had problems with as far as treatment centers bringing people there, because it is openly a Christian organization. Or the fact, I have a problem anyway with the idea of Christian treatment centers, but if those are private treatment centers and they're not taking government money, which I haven't ever investigated it or looked into it enough to find out. I mean, you've got corrupt organizations out there like the Salvation Army and things like that. But as far as private Christian treatment centers, I don't know how those work. Unfortunately, there's not a lot that could be done about those places if people voluntarily check in. But voluntary is that's kind of an iffy word when kind of like what I was talking about in my last video. A lot of people are manhandled into those kinds of places by family members that give them ultimatums. You got to go to this Christian treatment center for 1 year or whatnot. But I did see some of those treatment centers present when I went into a CR meeting, Celebrate Recovery. As far as differences go, the first thing, of course, obviously right off the bat I noticed was they obviously promote Christianity. Now, there again, I don't know how most ordinary people of a Christian belief would feel in a situation like CR, because everything from caffeine addiction to drinking alcohol to taking drugs to looking at porn or whatever is considered a sin, and therefore it's something that you have to supposedly work on. And if you're like me and you don't believe in the concept of an actual sin, then it wouldn't work for you at all, any more than a religious cult like AA would. As far as differences, the first thing I do remember, now you got to keep in mind, let me back up a second before I go too much into detail here. I only went to three different locations. So the only synopsis that I can provide for you is based on 3 different meetings that were CR meetings. I can't speak for, like with AA, I was in that over a decade, and I went to dozens of different meetings, and I can pretty much tell you they're all the same bunch of cult religious bullshit. With CR, I can't tell you how the format goes outside of 3 different meetings. So, before any CR people jump in here on this thread, if there are any, and they start saying, well, that's not true. I'm just telling you what I know from 3 meetings. The first thing that turned me off when I went into one was that it was going to be an hour and a half. Okay, I wasn't expecting that. I could barely at this time sit through an hour-long AA meeting, let alone an hour and a half. I didn't know what I was getting into. But it starts out with a lot of. It's kind of really strange. It starts out with a lot of singing. In fact, one group I went to, they almost had an alternative rock-sounding band. Of course, it's all a gospel-oriented style music, and everybody stands up and people wave their hands in the air and stuff like that. I was kind of, I guess, I was kind of more amused than anything at that point when I went into one. Now, I realize I grew up Catholic, and yeah, we do the stand up, kneel down, sit down, kneel, stand up, make the sign of the cross, and all that other kind of thing, but I've never been exposed to anything that was close to the Protestant fundamentalism, and so... I'm not shitting necessarily on that belief system entirely, but I'm saying that when people are waving their hands around like this, or when people are holding their hands up when people are talking, it was just, I'm sorry, it was amusing. The introductions there are completely different. The introductions take forever. In AA, I just say my name, I'm alcoholic, and you had a few old timers that would trip off of the introductions. I remember a guy that would say, I'm an alcoholic, and John is my problem, for example. Or I remember a guy would say, I'm an alcoholic whose addiction is me, or some shit like that. There were a few that tried cute little sayings like that, and there were the people that would introduce themselves as grateful recovering alcoholics, or shit like that. But this, as far as introductions go, some of the introductions these people were doing in these groups took forever. And usually the format was you had the singing, and then you had somebody get up and speak, and then you had groups split up into little groups. Now, these are the 3 I went to. Don't know how they're done elsewhere. And the introductions, literally, like I said, there was a couple of times I was almost like that, listening to people introduce themselves. They would say something like, my name is William. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I've been sanctified by the blood. My problems that I struggle with are alcohol, drugs, caffeine, nicotine, and relationships. And I was like, wow, I didn't know at first when I heard the first introduction that's how the general rule goes. People would say things like, my name is Jack, and I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. I've been saved by the blood of the Lamb, and my problem is codependency, and my problem is also anger and rage. And one of the weirdest ones I saw was a guy that just said he struggled with pleasures of the flesh. I didn't want to hear any details on that, but that was his introduction, and he was like a guru there. Their chip system, they got a chip for every freaking thing. The ones I went to, they got one for, just coming in like AA. Then they got one for 30 days, for 2 months, for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. It goes on all the way up into 2 years. It takes forever for them to do their little chip systems. And there again, the chip system is radically different from AA in the fact that, like I saw a guy pick up a 6-month, I forgot their colors. They got an array of colors. They got more colors than, a freaking kid's coloring book. But he picked up like a 6-month medallion chip or whatever it is. He was picking that up because he hadn't had a drink in 6 months. But then he picked up a newcomer chip because he was still struggling with temptation. There was a guy who picked up a 1-year medallion for no cigarettes in a year, but he picked up a 3-month chip because it'd only been 3 months since he'd had a drink. The chip ceremony goes on and on forever. That's something that those AA old-timers would never do. Although AA uses its singleness of purpose, and I think NA kind of has a broad definition of what addiction is, I've never seen anybody pick up a medallion for multiple years and then pick up a chip saying, well, I still struggle with temptations. I don't know what you mean when you say struggle with temptations. You kind of leave that in such a generalized form that could be everything, right? I ate an extra helping of candy over the holidays, so I'm struggling with temptation. I don't know. where that was going. The meetings themselves are completely segregated. The ones I went to when it come to women and men, there were men on this side of the room, women on that side of the room. They weren't allowed to talk to one another. They weren't allowed to speak to one another. AA old-timers would undoubtedly hate that because there wouldn't be much of a room for a playground. Now, as far as anything low down going on, like I said, I can't base too much out of what I saw. I only went to 3 meetings. I mean, I'm sure if you stuck around a CR meeting for a number of years, you would find the same kind of abuses, the same kind of underhanded behavior that I saw that was very dominant in AA. As far as the shares were concerned, you weren't allowed to swear. You weren't allowed to say anything that could be perceived as negative in terms of impinging upon people's recovery and all of that. And like I said, again, when they got to the sharing point, it takes forever. Like one guy said, he was a grateful believer. He was born again. He was sanctified by the blood of the Lamb. He said that he struggled with nicotine and caffeine, and he said he struggled with an addiction to gaming, and he struggled with the temptations of the flesh when it came to thoughts that would enter his head. I mean, it was like really far out. And I mean, I didn't introduce myself or anything. I wasn't called on. And, you know, I'm going to say the last few years I was in AA, I never spoke or never shared or nothing else. I mean, I just, for some reason, kept going to those freaking meetings and kept leaving and inevitably kept getting drunk again. So it's really strange since I left AA. I haven't had any problems with alcohol as far as staying away from booze. I mean, I haven't had a drink in a really long time, and I don't need chips, and I don't need fellowships, and I don't need being powerless or being told it's a sin to keep me away from alcohol. Imagine that. Leaving AA actually got me cured of drinking. Getting the weird programming in my head from AA, that took a lot longer. All those weird little voices and all that subtle brainwashing they do to you and all that breaking of your confidence and not believing in yourself and all of that, that was a little bit harder to get out from underneath. So as far as compare and contrast, I would say if you're religious in the way of, let's just say, the more fundamentalist, the more hardline approach to Christianity, and you were struggling with alcohol and you kind of, or nicotine and temptation and whatever else they say in there, you'd probably find a better fit into something like CR than you would AA. But if you're like most people I'm not going to say most people, that would be a sweeping generalization, but if you're like me and for whatever reasons you come to terms, like in my case, I can see very clearly a lot of the reasons why I became hopelessly addicted to booze and everything, and it didn't have nothing to do with sin, and it didn't have nothing to do with being selfish and self-centered like the bullshit AA talks about, or resentments, or any of the rest of that stuff. If you realize that your addiction, or at least if you're of the opinion that your addiction doesn't come from a moral failing, then CR wouldn't help you any more than AA would. The only thing that I can say in favor of CR is they don't hide the fact that they are an openly pro-Christian, pro-religious organization. But you would not feel comfortable in CR, obviously, if you were atheist, agnostic, or pagan, or Buddhist, or Islamic, or anything that's not remotely Christian, because their whole they don't have 12 steps, they have 8 steps, and every time they read a step, they read a beatitude out of the Bible. And they actually use a full version of the Serenity Prayer, which I didn't realize there was one until I got there, and the entire Serenity Prayer actually does deal with Jesus, God, the afterlife, and going to heaven and all that other kind of thing. Something that the AA members probably don't want you to know about, even though I always thought it was weird, even in the early days of AA when I believed in that crap. I always did think it was weird that a large majority of the AA meetings closed with the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, or whatever. It was like, okay, you say you're spiritual, not religious. How come we're praying this prayer? You know, I mean, but when that got brought up in that topic, it just crossed my mind. I had forgotten all about it. Like I said, I only went to 3 of them, and I was like, okay, this is not any better than AA as far as I'm concerned. In fact, it's worse because it's longer, because you have to have gospel singing, you have to have the hand waving, and you have to have, and the stories that you hear in sharing is about like AA, as far as the grandiose tales, and as far as everybody was a major badass when they were a drunk or a drug addict. Everybody was a major, you know, and everybody's miracle story is pretty far out, like in AA. Like I remember one guy was talking about how he was working in a factory, And he knew when he got off work he was going to go drink, and a new guy came up to him, and they got to talking, and somehow or the other, the new guy at work told him he was a recovering alcoholic, and the guy and he, talked each other out of going back out or whatever it is. And the guy finishes his story was, the next day I came back to the factory to tell the new guy how he saved my life, and he wasn't there. And I went to the factory manager and I said, "Where's the new guy?" And they said, "There is no new guy. We didn't hire a new guy." And I firmly believe Jesus came to my factory that day. Yeah, I mean, you would hear stories like that. So yeah, as far as the grandiosity, the tall tales and all of that, it's pretty much the same thing that you get in AA. And I don't know about the rest of my viewers out here, but it was vaguely amusing when I had only been in AA for a month to hear some of these tales, even though they sounded a little bit like bullshit. But, after a little while, I'm going to say, especially after you've been there years, it's just, it's painful. It's physically painful. I mean, I remember one guy that had 20 years. No, I actually remember several people like this. They would have 20, 30 years, and they would tell the same freaking stories that I had heard in the last 30 meetings and 40 meetings in the last few years, and people were still dying laughing over the crap like it was just the funniest thing they'd ever heard, And I used to see some of these people, they acted like they were trying out either for the Academy Awards or they were trying out for a stand-up comedy routine, because they would just blabber on and on and on with all this well-rehearsed, well-timed stuff and all these phony theatrics. And, I would hear people in AA say, alcoholics make great actors. No, you really don't. I mean, if you look at an Academy Award winning type of film and you look at the dramatics of it, you don't necessarily pay attention to dramatics itself because you're engrossed in the film. Like, if you're like me and you like to watch old classic films, when you're watching somebody like when you're watching some of the old stars like a Robert Mitchum, let's say, or a Cary Grant or a Gary Cooper from the past, you're not saying, boy, he's a really good actor, okay? You're engrossed in the film, something that AA people just really didn't have when it comes to terms of talent. But it's the same type of thing in CR as well. And anyway, those are just the differences I saw in those three meetings. The topic online that I couldn't type a response to got me to thinking about it, and I thought about making a video on it. If any of you have ever had experiences with CR, let me know what you found in it. Did you find the same old thing that AA is underneath the core of it all, or did you have a different experience entirely? Anyway, until next time, hopefully.